My mother betrayed me. She locked me in a psychiatric ward, gave my father's company to my younger brother, and told the world I was gone. 4 years later, I returned, with proof and a stone-cold heart. I was 29 when my father died, and with him, the last thread of certainty in my life snapped. He had built the cross-shipping empire from nothing, a man of iron discipline and unshakable vision. And for as long as I could remember, he prepared me to inherit it. The late nights in his office, the long talks about strategy, the endless drills on contracts, numbers, and loyalty, all of it was training. He never said it outright, but I knew. I was his successor, his firstborn son. When the time came, I thought the transition would be difficult but clear. My mother, however, had other plans. It began quietly, in whispers and subtle shifts. Meetings I was excluded from, papers shuffled behind closed doors. My younger brother, Adrian, was suddenly present where he had never been before, in boardrooms, at press conferences, sitting in my father's chair while it was still warm from his absence. At first, I didn't understand. Adrian was clever in a shallow way, good at charm, good at obedience, but he had no vision. He was not a leader, and everyone knew it. Everyone except my mother. She wanted control, and she knew Adrian would give it to her. One evening, I was called to the family estate. My mother sat at the head of the long dining table, Adrian beside her, smug in his silence. The air smelled of lavender and deceit. "Christopher," my mother said, with that practiced softness that fooled everyone but me, "your father's passing has left this family in a delicate position. Stability is more important than ego right now. Adrian will take over operations of the company. You will step back." I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I thought it was some cruel test, a power play to see if I would bend. But her eyes, cold, unblinking, told me it was real. I argued, of course. I laid out years of preparation, my father's wishes, my own qualifications. I told them Adrian wasn't ready, that he'd ruin everything. But the more I fought, the calmer she became, and the more smug Adrian looked. "Christopher," she said finally, her voice dropping like ice water, "this resistance of yours, it isn't rational. You're letting grief cloud your judgment. You're becoming unstable." That word, unstable. At the time, I thought it was just an insult, a weapon to silence me. I didn't know it was the beginning of something much darker. The weeks that followed blurred into a nightmare. My mother and Adrian painted me as erratic, paranoid, incapable of reason. Business partners were told I was unwell. Friends stopped returning calls. Doors that were once open slammed shut in my face. And then came the doctors. They arrived under the guise of concern, asking questions that twisted my words, scribbling notes with predetermined conclusions. Every protest I made sounded like madness when repeated in their cold reports. Even when I murmured, they made it seem I was speaking with my imaginary friends. Finally, one morning, men in white coats arrived at my apartment. They told me it was for my own good, that I needed rest, that I was a danger to myself. I fought them. God, I fought. But in the end, I was dragged out like a criminal while neighbors peered through their curtains. I was 29 years old, and my life ended in that moment. The psychiatric institution smelled of bleach and despair. They took my clothes, my phone, my dignity. They put me in a room with padded walls and a bed that creaked like it was ashamed of itself. I spent weeks trying to prove my sanity. I wrote letters. I explained the betrayal. I told them I was the rightful heir to a company my mother had stolen through manipulation. But the harder I tried, the worse it became. My words were twisted into evidence of paranoia. My anger was recorded as volatility. One day, after another failed attempt to argue my case, a doctor leaned in close and said, almost kindly, "Christopher, every word you speak only confirms why you're here." That was the moment I stopped fighting. Outwardly, I became docile, cooperative, silent. But inside, I sharpened myself. I began keeping journals, documenting every detail, names, dates, forged signatures, conversations overheard. My memory became a weapon, my pen a blade. I realized that the only way out was not to fight like a sane man, but to endure like a patient. My mother thought she had buried me. She thought she had silenced me. But in truth, she had forged me into something far more dangerous. And while they enjoyed the empire built on my father's blood, I waited in silence. counting the days, sharpening my mind. Because I knew, one day, the doors would open. And when they did, the world would remember the name Christopher Cross. For years, that's how long I wore the label of patient. 4 years of swallowing pills I hid under my tongue. For years of nodding along to doctors who thought silence was progress. For years of watching time drip like water through a crack in the ceiling. And then, one morning, the door opened. No ceremony, no apology, no acknowledgement of the years stolen. A new team of doctors had reviewed my case and decided I was fit to return to society. Fit. As though I were some broken machine, now patched together well enough to function. They handed me a plastic bag with my belongings, a wallet with expired cards, a wristwatch that no longer ticked, a phone so outdated it may as well have been a brick. That was all that remained of my former life. When I walked out of that institution, the air felt too sharp, the sky too wide. Freedom should have tasted sweet, but it was bitter, because freedom without power is just another kind of prison. In those 4 years, the world had moved on. My mother still sat like a queen behind the throne, and Adrian, my little brother, now carried himself as the heir apparent of cross-shipping. Newspapers praised his vision. Magazines fawned over his modern leadership. But I knew the truth. He was nothing more than a puppet, dangling from strings my mother pulled. And me? I was a ghost. To everyone else, Christopher Cross was the unstable son who'd cracked under grief. No one wanted to hear my story. No one wanted to know the truth. So I disappeared into the city. I rented a small, damp room above a laundromat. I worked odd jobs, cash under the table. I walked streets where no one recognized me. At night, I pored over my journals, each page a reminder that I hadn't imagined it all. Each word a seed for the future. I could not reclaim the 4 years they had stolen, but I could decide how the rest of my years would be spent. And I would not waste them on despair. I would learn. I would watch. I would wait. Because my mother and brother believed the institution had broken me. But what it had truly done was temper me. The forgotten patient had returned to the world. And one day, the world would learn what that meant. The first lesson I learned after leaving the institution was simple. Truth means nothing without power. I had the truth. My journals were filled with it. Dates, signatures, conversations that could damn them all. But I was a man with no reputation, no credibility. The very mention of my name brought smirks, pity, or suspicion. Who would believe the story of Christopher Cross, the mad heir? No, if I was going to reclaim my life, if I was going to destroy theirs, I needed more than truth. I needed to become untouchable. So I buried myself in study. In the mornings, I read law textbooks I borrowed from secondhand stores, learning how words on paper could become cages stronger than steel. In the afternoons, I worked whatever jobs I could find. Janitor, night clerk, temp assistant. Nothing permanent, nothing that tied me down. Work was survival, not purpose. My true labor began when the sun fell. At night, I spread my journals across the floor of that tiny room above the laundromat, mapping every piece of the puzzle. My mother, Adrian, their allies, the doctors who signed the papers, the lawyers who turned blind eyes. Each name connected to another, a web of betrayal that pulsed like a living thing. I was not ready to strike, not yet, but I would learn the shape of the web before I tore it apart. In time, I began to move through circles of people who cared about the same wounds I bore. Activists fighting against wrongful institutionalization, journalists chasing corruption, small advocacy groups trying to protect those who had no voice. I never gave them my full story. Instead, I asked questions. I listened. I became the man in the corner who knew a little too much about medical fraud, inheritance disputes, forged reports. I spoke in hypotheticals, in parables, and they listened, because unlike the broken men they were used to, I spoke with clarity, with control. One journalist in particular, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn, once leaned close and whispered, "You sound like you've lived this." I smiled and said nothing. Silence is a powerful answer. Patience became my mask. Outwardly, I was quiet, rebuilding, surviving. But inside, the fire never dimmed. Every headline about Adrian's success was fuel. Every photo of my mother smiling for the cameras was another ember in the furnace of my resolve. They thought I was gone, erased, forgotten. But I was here, sharpening myself against the stone of time. And I swore, when the moment came, I would not simply take back what was mine. No, I would unravel them thread by thread, until the world saw them not as leaders, not as visionaries, but as the cowards and liars they truly were. All I needed was time. And after 4 years in a padded cage, time was the one thing I had learned to master. Revenge does not begin with fire. It begins with whispers. I knew better than to confront them outright. My proof was not strong enough to destroy them in a courtroom, not yet. But I understood something more valuable. Perception is stronger than evidence. If you plant enough doubt, even lies can sound like truth, and truth becomes inevitable. So I began where it mattered most, the court of public opinion. I reached out, quietly, to voices that carried weight online. Whistleblowers who would say anything for the right price. Bloggers who thrived on scandal and speculation. Journalists too ambitious to ignore the scent of blood. I paid them not just with money, but with carefully crafted stories, delivered in fragments, each one believable enough to spark debate. The first wave was subtle. Allegations of nepotism. Whispers that Adrian had never earned his seat at the head of cross-shipping, that he was nothing more than a puppet dancing to his mother's strings. Memes circulated of Adrian as a marionette, his mother's hands pulling invisible wires. People laughed, but they remembered. The second wave was sharper. Claims of misconduct. Whispers of my mother's inappropriate relationship with a younger company executive. Rumors that she kept him close not for his talent, but for her own appetites. It was salacious, easy for people to believe, and impossible for her to disprove without dignifying it. And then came the cruelest, most personal strike, a whisper from the shadows, that I was not truly her son. The blog spoke of me as a stepson, resented from the beginning, punished for being loved by my father more than she or Adrian ever were. They wrote of how she systematically destroyed the one man her late husband trusted most. They painted me as a ghost, erased, silenced. She denied it all, of course. She dismissed the bloggers as attention seekers, liars, digital vultures feeding on grief. But her denials didn't matter. The seeds had already been planted, and doubt, once planted, does not die. It grows. And then, just as the whispers reached their peak, came the thunder. Government auditors announced an investigation into cross-shipping for tax evasion. Headlines screamed of hidden accounts, inflated invoices, and shady offshore dealings. The empire that once seemed untouchable was suddenly under a microscope. Investors grew nervous. Partners whispered about distancing themselves. Shareholders demanded answers. And when the first lawsuits hit, angry former employees, cheated contractors, even rival companies smelling blood, the empire began to sway. I watched it all unfold from the shadows, sipping cheap coffee in my rented room, reading every article with a quiet smile. Because what they didn't know was this. Every whisper, every rumor, every document that found its way into the light had come from me. I was no longer the forgotten patient. I was the ghost in their walls. And the cracks in their empire had only just begun to show. The whispers had done their work. What began as rumors and blogs had now hardened into headlines, subpoenas, and lawsuits. Cross-shipping was no longer the pride of the industry. It was a scandal waiting to explode. The first blow came in court. Tax authorities dragged Adrian into hearings, demanding answers about offshore accounts and creative accounting. He arrived in an expensive tailored suit, all smiles for the cameras, but it didn't last. The reporters ate him alive. Mr. Cross, can you confirm you signed these transfers? Why were millions routed through shell companies in the Caymans? Is it true your mother's personal expenses were disguised as company costs? At first, Adrian tried to charm his way through, laughing, deflecting, calling it all a misunderstanding. But charm is a fragile currency, and under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom, it evaporated. The world saw him sweat. The media frenzy was merciless. Clips of Adrian fumbling for answers went viral. Talk shows dissected every stutter, every crack in his composure. Memes painted him as a spoiled child caught stealing cookies. Headlines shifted from admiration to mockery. Golden heir or hollow puppet? Adrian Cross melts under pressure. The family empire built on lies. Every denial only fanned the flames. My mother tried to steady the ship. She issued statements, insisting Adrian was a victim of unfounded attacks, that cross-shipping was still strong, that the family stood united. But the more she spoke, the more hollow it sounded. And then the lawsuits multiplied. Former employees came forward, claiming wrongful terminations, abuse, and corruption. Competitors alleged rigged contracts. Investors threatened to pull out unless Adrian stepped down. One night, as I watched the news flicker across my small TV, I saw Adrian outside the courthouse. Cameras swarmed him, flashing lights like vultures circling prey. His face was pale, his tie crooked, his words stumbling. He was falling apart. And the beauty of it was this: I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to reveal myself. The truth, sharpened by a little pressure, was tearing him apart better than I ever could. By now, whispers had turned into roars. The public no longer asked if cross-shipping was corrupt. They asked how much longer it would survive. And as for Adrian, the once proud face of the company, he was now a punchline. All it took was time, and I had learned how to use time better than anyone. But the storm had only just begun. Because what happens when a puppet falls apart? Everyone starts looking at the hands that held the strings. And soon, the world would turn its gaze to my mother. The court was packed. Cameras crowded the steps, microphones thrust like weapons, and reporters barked questions as though blood was in the air. This wasn't just about cross-shipping anymore. It was about the Cross family itself. The empire, the scandals, the betrayals, everything had built to this moment. And there, at the center of it, sat my mother. She was dressed in black, a widow's color, though she hadn't been a widow in spirit for years. Her eyes glistened with rehearsed tears, her hands trembling just enough to look delicate. When the prosecutor pressed her about the corruption, the nepotism, the forged documents, she didn't fight. She wept. "Oh, if only Christopher were still with us," she sobbed, voice quivering for the cameras. "He was troubled, yes, but he was my son. I always loved him as if he were my own. If only he hadn't turned to substances. If only he hadn't ruined himself. I prayed for him every night. I only ever wanted to protect him." Gasps rippled through the room. Some journalists scribbled eagerly. Others frowned. I sat in the gallery, anonymous among the crowd, and felt my blood run cold. Not because her lies hurt me anymore, but because of the ease with which she told them. She had turned my stolen years into a morality play where she was the grieving mother, and I the tragic addict who destroyed himself. And then she twisted the knife. "I wish Christopher were here today," she whispered, dabbing her eyes. "I wish he could stand beside me, so I could tell him I loved him, that I never stopped loving him." The court was silent. Cameras zoomed in. For a moment, it seemed she had regained control. But then I stood up. At first, no one noticed. A man in a plain suit, moving quietly down the aisle. The judge glanced up. The reporters stirred. My mother's eyes flickered toward me, and I saw it. Recognition, sharp and immediate. She froze. I stepped into the light. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, calm, stronger than it had ever been in that institution. "The woman you see before you is not a grieving mother. She is a liar. She locked me away in a psychiatric ward for 4 years to steal my inheritance, and today she stands here pretending to mourn the son she tried to erase." The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Journalists shouted. My mother went pale, her tears drying instantly as though someone had flipped a switch. I walked forward, slow, deliberate, until I stood just feet away from her. "You claim you loved me as your own," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "But you never did. I was my father's son, not yours. You resented that. You resented that he trusted me more than you or Adrian. So you called me unstable. You forged papers. You caged me like an animal." She shook her head violently, mouthing no, no, no. But the cameras were on me now. "You told this court you wished I were here." Well, I leaned closer, lowering my voice so the microphone caught every word. "Here I am." The silence was electric. Reporters scrambled to record, their pens scratching like knives on paper. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but no one listened. My mother sat trembling, her mask shattered. Adrian, beside her, looked like a boy caught stealing sweets, his face ashen, his jaw slack. In that moment, the entire world saw the truth. The forgotten patient had returned, and their empire of lies had just collapsed under the weight of a single name: Christopher Cross. The storm that followed my unmasking was unlike anything I had imagined. The media tore through every record, every contract, every backroom deal cross-shipping had ever touched. Lawsuits buried the company in paperwork. Investors fled. Ships sat rusting at the docks, containers abandoned mid-journey, clients scrambling for alternatives. Adrian vanished from the public eye, his face a symbol of arrogance undone. My mother tried to hold press conferences, but every word rang hollow. She became a caricature, the manipulative matriarch exposed at last. Within months, cross-shipping, the empire my father had built from sweat and salt water, collapsed into bankruptcy. And I let it. Because revenge wasn't about inheriting their ruins. It was about freeing myself from their shadow. But I wasn't done. From those ashes, I began building something new. A company not forged on corruption or nepotism, but on the values my father had lived by: honesty, hard work, and vision. I named it True North Logistics, in honor of the man who always believed in guiding me, even when he was gone. We started small, a handful of ships, a modest office, a team of people who had once been crushed under my mother's rule. But word spread quickly. Former clients who had fled the sinking Cross Empire turned to us, hungry for stability. Investors recognized something they hadn't seen in years: integrity. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by the Cross name. I was building something that was mine, something that carried my father's spirit, not my mother's poison. And yet, some nights, I would sit alone in my office, staring out at the harbor. I'd see the rusting husks of ships once branded with the Cross crest, now fading, forgotten. And I'd think, that was never truly mine. That was theirs. And it died with them. They buried me once, called me insane, forgotten. But the world has a way of remembering the truth. My name is Christopher Cross. The empire that tried to erase me lies in ruins. And from its ashes, I built something my father would have been proud of. In the end, revenge wasn't about destroying them. It was about proving they could never destroy me. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, drop your comments for the algorithm, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.